I have a short reading I would like to share with you before the sermon. And by way of introducing it, I want to tell you about the most worshipful event I was ever at in my life. It wasn't at church. Not one of ours, not one belonging to any other religious community. It was a concert in Stamford, Connecticut. When I went to see Peter, Paul, and Mary perform one of their last public performances before retiring permanently because of Mary Travers' health. It was an amazing event. I wasn't planning on telling this story, but it was an amazing event. The age demographic of the people attending that concert was the widest I have ever seen at a public performance. There were babes in arms, and there were people there over 100 years old with their walkers. It was just remarkable diversity. The congregation, the audience, call it what you will, sang along, often during the course of the service, concert, call it what you will. And at the end of the evening, I could hardly speak anymore. I was just overwhelmed with a mix of emotions. But one of the most remarkable parts of that evening was when Mary Travers, her voice starting to show that retirement was coming, sang the song, "Have You Been to Jail for Justice?" And they sang it with great vigor, and in the end was Mary Travers with that unmistakable growl of hers, "Let them haul you off to jail." What an evening. In light of the meditation, I would like to dedicate the reading to Jill's aunt. From the pen of Henry David Thoreau, who did something similar. Thoreau wrote, "Unjust laws exist. Shall we be content to obey them, or shall we endeavor to amend them and obey them until we have succeeded? Or shall we transgress them at once? People generally, under such a government as this, think that they ought to wait until they have persuaded the majority to alter them. They think that if they should resist, the remedy would be worse than the evil. But it is the fault of the government itself that the remedy is worse than the evil. It makes it worse. Why is it not more apt to anticipate and provide for reform? Why does it not cherish its wise minority? Why does it cry and resist before it is hurt? Why does it not encourage its citizens to put out its faults and to do better than it would have? Why does it always crucify Christ and excommunicate Copernicus and Luther, pronounce Washington and Franklin rebels? So ends the reading, written after Henry Thoreau's sojourn in jail. In his slim but powerful volume On Tyranny, which he published at the beginning of the first Trump presidency, Timothy Snyder, the Levin Professor of History at Yale University, who is a preeminent scholar of authoritarian movements in the 20th century, presents 20 lessons from the 20th century. As a historian, Snyder believes that history is instructive. Even though it never truly repeats itself, history does offer warnings to the succeeding generations of people who are familiar with the historical record and open to its lessons. Unfortunately, like grammar and mathematics, most people seem allergic to the study of history, preferring the folklore that masquerades as history, rich as it is in tribal prejudice and unexamined assumptions, carefully curated grievances, and dramatic stories of conquest and triumph. Noting that the founders of the American Republic looked to the history of Greece and Rome to understand how tyrants seize the reins of power, Snyder writes, "The good news is that we can draw upon more recent and relevant examples than ancient Greece and Rome. The bad news is that the history of modern democracy is also one of decline and fall." Identifying three major democratic moments during the 20th century: the creation of the independent nation states following the First World War, the democratization, decline of colonialism and New World Order following the Second World War, and the extension of democratic governance following the collapse of Soviet communism. He cautions that the new democracies established during these periods often floundered and failed, and that resemblances between their circumstances and those of America during the last decade were not without parallels. Even long-established democracies are not protected automatically, let alone magically, from authoritarian threats. Today, those with authoritarian impulses, an aspiring new generation of fascists, if you will, have mastered the manipulation of democratic institutions and mechanisms, creating the conditions whereby a plurality can masquerade as a majority, an oligarchy as a democracy, and the will of a megalomaniac as the will of the people. We live in perilous times. But the fact of the matter is that we've always lived in perilous times. The primary difference between the perilous times we recognize and the periods of relative safety is whether or not we're conscious of the threats that exist at all times and willing to invest our efforts in countering them. It is against this backdrop that Timothy Snyder offers his 20 lessons, which, if our American neighbors had paid attention to them during the 4-year reprieve they received during the interregnum between the first Trump administration and the second, might have changed the very course of history. Not only for the United States, but for the entire world, our own trembling country included. We are shakers. Defend institutions, admonishes Snyder. Believe in truth. Be calm when the unthinkable arrives, and be as courageous as you can. These are just 4 of the 20 pointed pieces of advice he offers. But his first piece of advice for resisting the onslaught of autocratic, authoritarian, illiberal leadership is this: do not obey in advance. Most of the power of authoritarianism is freely given. In times like these, individuals think ahead about what a more repressive government will want, and then offer themselves without even being asked. A citizen who adapts in this way to teaching power what it can do is teaching power to what it can do. Just say no was a slogan from 4 decades ago, which began as an effort to counter the use of illegal drugs before coming to be parroted in a variety of contexts. Just say no to lutefisk, and just say no to broccoli and Brussels sprouts were among my favorite parodies. But comedy aside, we could do worse than reclaim and repurpose this slogan in response to the authoritarian decrees of the man with the Sharpie, which affect not only our American neighbors, but also the people of this country and its allies. Just say no. Take the threat of tariffs for one example among many. But more significantly, perhaps, consider the ways in which diversity, equity, and inclusion have been undermined in the private sector, or the license that has effectively been given to attack people on the basis of race, national origin, gender identity, sexual orientation, and so on down the list. The advances of civil liberties that have been achieved during our lifetime, just our lifetime. Remember that lunch counters in Woolworths happened when most of us in this room were already alive. The advances of civil liberties that have been achieved have been rolled back, and the effects are being felt around the globe, not just south of our border. Once again, the United States has withdrawn from the United Nations Human Rights Council, a signal that it has abandoned the protection of human rights not only at home, but around the world. It is a global human rights crisis. In his book, Snyder points to the anticipatory obedience of Austrians, adapting instinctively without reflecting to a new situation when Germany threatened annexation early in 1938. The annexation followed. When people with military power talk about annexing a neighboring country, we need to take them seriously, whether or not they're bluffing. It has happened, and it will somewhere, someday, happen again. It is happening elsewhere at this moment. It is our nature as human beings most of the time to calm the waters and try to maintain equilibrium as best we can. Whether we're at a family dinner, out in the community, or navigating the relations between countries, we all have that uncle or aunt who makes family dinners difficult. Our desire for peace may sometimes overwhelm our commitment to what is right. But just as we may sometimes have to say no to the proverbial drunk uncle at Thanksgiving dinner, we must also sometimes reject the demands of the powerful, even though we may feel less than powerful ourselves. Do not obey in advance. Just say no. We are being called to such a moment. The willingness to obey in advance has been seen most clearly among the billionaires and the corporations who immediately capitulated to the whims of Donald Trump by pandering to his fragile ego and implementing policy changes even before they were demanded in order to ingratiate themselves to the new administration. It's hard to fathom why those most secure in their power would be the first to capitulate. But perhaps they fear they have the most to lose, or else they sense that they have the most to gain. Who knows? Whatever their motivations, they will never be held up as profiles in courage. For the most part, I've been pleased to see Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's responses to Trump's threats and insults. But he compromised himself and the country when he flew to Mar-a-Lago following the US election, obeying in advance. That visit never should have happened. He was obeying in advance, and that act alone would have been reason enough for Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland to resign from the cabinet. It was Freeland who instinctively understood how to respond to the new administration, that is to say, the regurgitation of the old administration, while the Prime Minister blinked, especially since she was being asked to give up the finance ministry in order to oversee relations with the US government. What could have been the most important and demanding portfolio over the next 4 years was undermined by an ill-conceived act of tribute. But overall, the Canadian government has responded strongly, and interestingly enough, there has been a surge in Canadian unity. Whoever would have imagined that parties from left to right, even a majority of the party most likely to opt out of the consensus, would come together? Who would ever have imagined people in Montreal standing up and singing "O Canada" at the top of their lungs? Who could have conceived of such unity in this country? But there's nothing like an external threat to bring even most of the separatists to the common table. Most remarkable of all, however, are the ways in which Canadians have independently rallied in disobedience to the threats of the new US administration. And this happened in less than a month, less than 2 weeks, less than a single week, as I recall. It seems so long ago in this eternity of a month. The boycott of American goods has been dramatic and powerful. I was in a major grocery store just a couple of days ago and noticed empty spaces on the shelves where customers had chosen Canadian-made products over those from south of the border. Empty shelves. This was a dramatic change from only a couple of weeks ago when I was easily able to navigate through the checkout with a cart filled only with groceries from Canada, Mexico, and Germany. I do still have my European tastes. If Canadians stick to what is now an obvious but informal boycott, it is bound to change supply chains and perhaps even result in a permanent change in Canadians' shopping habits. It is also likely to build support among manufacturers of items in the United States who rely upon their Canadian markets. Travel has been similarly affected, though not quite as dramatically, as the demand for travel to US destinations has plummeted. Ironically, this may have also led to increased border security, since fewer people seem willing to cross it, and as a consequence, border officers have, well, for the moment, less to do. You see, civil disobedience can take many forms. We needn't change ourselves to fences and light standards, disrupt public meetings, or necessarily join protest marches to express our unwillingness to support actions we consider arbitrary and unjust. It's possible to disobey without those being disobeyed even catching on at first. And by the time they do, it may be too late for them to do much about it. Lost sales, lost profits, lost power can be hard to reverse. And there are many positive ways to be disobedient as well. While the US government abandons Ukraine, we can increase our support for that country and its struggle against invasion. As the US essentially criminalizes diversity, equity, and inclusion, I can hardly believe I have to say that out loud. As the US essentially criminalizes diversity, equity, and inclusion, we can pressure Canadian institutions to redouble their initiatives. We can provide support to our American friends and family, our neighbors, to encourage them that diversity and equity and inclusion are still worth fighting for because they still stand on the higher moral ground. As corporations acquiesce to demands in the U.S., we can hold them accountable in our courts under our laws if they try to do those things here. And given the threat to members of the LGBTQ2S community, when Pride Winnipeg rolls around this year, we can all show as we are able, we can all show up as we are able to march in the parade, to show our support at the booth, to keep vigil here at the church. This year's Pride Festival may be the most important one of our lifetime, save for the very first. So when we show up, we are disobeying those who seek to roll back half a century of progress. For now, Canada's governments and the people seem to be on the same page, save for one or two provincial governments, which makes Canadian disobedience easier. We're all in this together. No one, not even an invading force, can lock us all up if the time comes. As a religious movement, disobedience is in our genes. In England, Unitarians emerged within a religious movement that was dubbed Nonconformity, and we were often called nonconformists or dissenters, alongside the Presbyterians, Congregationalists, Baptists, and others. Although Unitarians could be found in England as far back as the 17th century, it was actually illegal to be one until 1813, nearly 40 years after the first avowedly Unitarian chapel was established. Could you imagine if we were prepared in this congregation to be illegal for 4 decades? Can you imagine the possibility for the influence that that might have in the larger society? Before then, therefore, professing Unitarian ideas was a criminal offense, even if the law wasn't always enforced. And it wasn't legal for Unitarians to hold office in the United Kingdom until 1828, although many did so clandestinely. Over on these shores, Henry David Thoreau argued that individual conscience was superior to the laws of the state, and that when the two were in conflict, the individual is called to disobey the law. In 1846, after Thoreau had refused to pay his poll tax for half a dozen years as an act of civil disobedience to protest slavery and the Mexican-American War, he willingly went to jail, believing that doing so would draw attention to the injustice of both evils. It's said that when Ralph Waldo Emerson visited him in jail, the eminent philosopher asked, "Henry, why are you here?" Prompting Thoreau to respond, "Why are you not here?" He was finally released over his own resistance after his aunt paid the poll tax on his behalf. It reminded me of the time many years ago when Karen Ridd, the daughter of University of Winnipeg professor Carl Ridd, was imprisoned in El Salvador. And knowing that the colleague that she was in prison with would be in grave danger if she were to leave, refused to leave the Salvadoran prison until her friend's exit route was secured. Thoreau's term civil disobedience is actually offered as a double entendre. On the one hand, he was arguing for the moral obligation to disobey the civil authority when it was in fundamental conflict with one's conscience. On the other hand, he was urging those who resist to do so in a civil manner. That is, in a way that was temperate and peaceful, respecting the legitimate authority of the state and the rights of others. Thoreau's essay is said to have influenced both the Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. in developing their ideas of nonviolent resistance. So both the Indian independence movement and the American civil rights movement cannot be imagined without it. From Gandhi's Salt March to the sit-ins at segregated lunch counters in the American South. As authoritarianism is on the rise, with its false promises of security and prosperity, we are once again called to embrace our heritage of nonconformity and civil disobedience. We may be called extremists by some, but as Timothy Snyder writes, when tyrants speak of extremists, they just mean people who are not in the mainstream, as the tyrants themselves are defining that mainstream at that particular moment. Everything, that is, except what is actually extreme, their ideology. If you once believed that everything always turns out well in the end, Snyder cautions, you can be persuaded that nothing turns out well in the end. If you once did nothing because you thought progress is inevitable, then you can continue to do nothing because you think time moves in repeating cycles. For the rest of us, those who believe that nothing is inevitable, but certain things are desirable, those who are confident that how things turn out will be determined in large measure by our own devotion to some higher purpose. For the rest of us, we must embrace the insight of Hannah Arendt, who wrote, "I was no longer of the opinion that one can simply be a bystander." Like that. That's what we're called to do. Just like that. We are shakers, called to be Hare the hero. When our moment comes, as it will come time and again in the course of our lives, may we recognize that we cannot be bystanders, even though we might wish to stand on the sidelines. That we must not obey in advance, even when it's expedient. Because civil disobedience is an inherent feature of our tradition. And that we are called by our faith to be nonconformists and dissenters, even when it is difficult, especially when it is difficult. Please join in hymn number 168 in the gray hymnal, One More Step.